Hi, I'm John Atack, and I'm talking again with Pat Ryan. And we have some specific points that Pat would like to pick up on that came from our last conversation.
Yeah, so there was one was the term cult, the religious movement. We brought up the Eileen Barker, and I wrote a word down, diplomacy. The term cult, that's an interesting term, and then new religious movement. So many of the groups I deal with are not religious.
No, absolutely.
So the new religious movement doesn't fit. I don't. I just gave a talk about this to a family. I said, look, if you use the word cult in our communications with your child, it's going to cost you $5,000. I usually put a price tag on it. It's going to be like 5 of us talking to her for 5 days, and they're going to be arguing about this word. So it's a very expensive word. It's an arbitrary dollar amount. I just wanted to make the point. So I don't talk about cults because I still don't find a good definition. I know that if you go on International Cultic Studies website, there's a lot of articles about the definitional issues surrounding cult.
As Jolly West's excellent definition as well. But I moved aside a long time ago and said, I'm not bothered about any new religious movements, cults. I'm bothered about authoritarianism. I'm bothered about somebody having authority over somebody else and the somebody else just believing it, not checking it. And I would say that about 2/3 of human beings are authoritarian. They believe in leaders, or they want to be the bully that's at the top. And I think that's what's wrong, and that's what, if we are ever to have a civilization, what we have to change. So I'll talk about an authoritarian group or an authoritarian relationship. And that way, as yet, nobody's taught me about a new religious authoritarianism.
Wait, but then we don't have to have that argument if it's new or not.
Well, new, of course, a new religious movement means either from 1830 with Joseph Smith, or post World War II, according to Eileen Barker, or the word new has dissolved. And of course, the problem is, I went through Brian Wilson's criteria, who's at the base of all of this, the definitions of religion, and he happens to use Scientology in one of his pieces to define this. I went through his criteria, and they apply more closely to the Manson family than they do to Scientology. So by his definition, the Manson family was a new religious movement. And at that point, I'm saying, this is a useless term.
It is useless. The term I use is cultic relationship. So, and I think in your term, you might use authoritarian relationship.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what I think is that groups, and I try to use the word groups, and even though it's a one-on-one group, groups change from time to time and place to place.
Yeah,
they evolve, and humans, we have changed from time to time and place to place. And what I'm looking at is the interaction of a particular person at a particular time in their life with a group at a particular time in its life cycle. It's that interaction that creates this dynamic, the cultic dynamic. Now, if we look at Langoni's suggestion from cobbling together some research that about 90% of the people who affiliate with these type of groups leave on their own. You look at Barker's research.
How can you make a generalization about thousands of groups? Eileen Barker also, in her book New Religious Movement, says you can't make generalizations. And she always comes back to the 11% in the one study of the Moonies that she did. You can't make generalizations.
I agree.
Yeah.
But
45% of medical doctors in Germany joined the Nazi party. Where's your 11% gone? You know?
Well, but I think the point is that most people who join these systems leave, and I think from just a subjective view of groups that we know, that we see around, and, at one point there were hundreds of thousands of Hare Krishnas, and now there's very few. I mean, just from interaction. At one point there was lots of Scientologists, and the centers were full, and there's less.
Yeah, so but I would add to this, from my experience directly with about 600 Scientologists in their recovery, most of those 600 joined another group.
Yeah.
So they cult hop. So we have to look at it a bit more carefully, that once somebody's been made susceptible, and again with you, that you continued to have experiences for years afterwards, which were the concomitant with the processes that you'd been through.
Yes.
You've been through.
Absolutely.
I saw a Scientologist. I remember a guy who had a master's degree from Yale, and he joined Santeria. So he's basically practicing voodoo after 15 years of
practicing voodoo. I mean, Scientology. I'm being sarcastic.
Well, there are no chickens involved in Scientology.
That's OT 46.
Oh no!
No, I think that Paul Martin and the people who, this is again, it's a subset of people who have left groups, joined groups, left groups. They probably had an intervention. They went through Wellspring. Oh, the recidivism rate of joining another group was about 5%, somewhere around there.
If they've been through Wellspring. Yeah.
Yes, after they went through their program.
Yeah.
So that the education component may influence people. And so if we could agree that most people who join groups leave.
Well, I don't know that. I just don't know that. Yeah. I've met many people who spent decades in a group, and I'm not really sure what the flow through rate is.
Okay.
So I just don't know that, and I don't think there's sufficient research because
you're right.
Already about what 3,000 groups in the US that
I don't know how many
Awareness Network used to talk about as cults, whatever that is. We don't even agree what that is. So
we don't even agree with that.
Yeah.
But if I look at like the TM movement, when I was involved, they say 10 million people have learned. When I was involved, about 1 million people have learned. About 50,000 have become teachers. Maybe a little bit more had learned to levitate. And when Maharishi begged the world and put pressure on everyone that they had to come to this one course with 8,000 people, and for many people it was paid, they could barely get 8,000 people. And so when I look at my graduating class from the Maharishi U, most of them are no longer affiliated with the movement.
But what about if you looked at the Watchtower Society and the Jehovah's Witnesses, who can have 7 to 8 million members, and they've been bleeding out in the last few years, but for many years that was a constant. It stayed there, and people stayed with it. So I think there are too many variables in this equation to call something a cult, let alone to determine whether people will stay in it.
Stay or leave. So I'm not going to disagree with what you're saying in principle. I would say anecdotally, at least the groups that I've interacted with, most of them people leave.
Yeah. What about North Korea? What's your experience?
Well, I have no experience with North Korea. Now, if the leader left, there might be a lot of people who leave. We don't know. We don't know.
We do know. This man was the poet laureate of North Korea, and he had to leave because he had the special privilege, because he wrote propaganda. He wrote to pretend South Korean newspapers to be given to the North Koreans to show how much the South Koreans envied them. So he was allowed to borrow books from the library. And one day he borrowed a book from the library, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice or something, lent it to a friend, and his friend said, "I'm so sorry, I left it on the train." And they both knew they had to leave the country that day or die.
Wow.
So, I think it's worth extremist, authoritarian, totalitarian, that those sort of regimes, it may not be that easy for people to walk away or walk out. And certainly born-in members, second generations,
very difficult.
The dynamic is so different. So I'm just sort of, I'm bristling. That was the word you used before. At the generalization. Certainly with TM or with the Krishnas or with Scientology, the Way International, these groups have come and gone. But where did the members go? Did they go back home and now become perfectly enlightened citizens?
Or
did they go to North Korea to live?
Well, it's a very interesting question. Is one that I have. I'm in numerous Facebook groups with members of the TM movement, and a lot of people have started their own groups too. And then there are those who I had interactions with at some time early on who left and never joined another group.
We tracked 200 groups that have been started by ex-Scientologists since 1950, and that was in 1993. I don't know how many more there are. So many of them, for me, the dogma is more important than the leader. I
Yeah.
don't take the view of charisma particularly strongly, because most people, I never met Ron Hubbard,
No.
and he certainly didn't seem very charismatic to me as I learned more about his life. So that bond of charisma, I don't think, is usually in a larger group as important as bonding with the dogma. And I think it's a mistake that's often made, the thought that you can just leave a group and leave behind the things you came to believe.
Oh.
So I've always worked with people to actually look at the dogma and say, which parts of it do you still believe?
Yeah.
Keep thinking with it. It's up to you. It's not, something that I'm going to excavate or extirpate from you.
I agree. I mean, I have an appreciation for an Eastern, viewpoint. It doesn't mean it's right or wrong. It's just I appreciate it.
Yeah, I too am fond of the Bhagavad Gita and the Buddhist sutras, and there's
more than I have an appreciation from the biblical tradition which I come from.
Yeah,
but not. It's just different. So just going back, I look at this interaction of the person and a group.
Yeah.
At a particular point in the time. And for some people, I think that creates a cultic relationship, and others it doesn't. So
agree, yeah.
For me, when I joined TM and got involved, as we described earlier yesterday, the talk before, I had a cultic relationship with it for some period of time.
Yeah.
My mother learned it, and she practiced it till the time she died. It's because it lowered her blood pressure. Did she have a cultic relationship with it? No. But there's a person who goes to the local center and spends $1,000 and goes through all the hocus pocus, learn TM. Are they in a cult? Is the person who's teaching them it in a cultic relationship with the movement? More likely. But it's individualized, and that's the point I think I'm driving to, is that we have to look at each of the individuals that we run into, their lives. Do they have a cultic relationship with authoritarian relationship with a particular system, be it religious, political, one-on-one, whatever category it goes on? So in that sense, the word cult is not useful for me.
Yeah.
Now, it's an interesting experience that when it comes to Eileen Barker and the word cult. So the people of the we can use the rubric of cult apologists, so to speak. The sociologists of new religious movements viewed this word cult was a bad word, and they really held it strong. But in Madrid, I can tell you what year it was. It was about 10 years ago, 15 years ago. ICSA had a conference at the University of Madrid. And myself and Joe Kelly ran, I think, 6 sessions for former members. And Eileen Barker actually, she was making a presentation with Ben Zablocki, and she said, as a sociologist of religion, I would love to attend the former member workshop. I understand why people wouldn't want me to attend the former workshop. That's clear. But from an academic point of view, I think that if you would like me to have a different view than I have, if I can't see, I can't write. So I brought it to the authorities at that time that were running the conference, and I said, if I put on an extra session that is not on the schedule and told the people that a cult apologist, so to speak, is going to be in attendance. If you want to attend, you can. If you don't want to attend, it's not a scheduled thing. And the board agreed that it was an acceptable thing to do, as long as there was a lot of caveats as to what was going on.
Yeah.
So she came to this workshop, hour and a half talk, and we started it with a question. And the question was, is the term cult necessary to describe your experience, or is it what Lifton would call a thought terminating cliche? I thought it would be an interesting question. And the room sort of divided into three groups. So there's one group of people who had just left their groups.
Hmm.
And they started talking about when they heard the term cult, it started making sense of what had happened to them.
Hmm.
They could coalesce around it.
Yeah.
And there was one woman who'd been out of her group for about 14 years. She was an attorney. She said, it's really a useless term to me. I recognize, the abuse and all of those things. I also know what part I played in it, the usefulness it had for me, the problems it had for me. It was another view. And I forgot what the middle group, but it was divided into about three kind of sections.
Hmm.
And after that, Eileen Barker started using the word cult.
Yeah.
She talked about that it was a useful term because people who were harmed by groups, it was something they could coalesce about. And she said, I think it's a useful term.
That's interesting. I mean, for me, it's like using the word illness, which is useful when you know there's something wrong. But when you know what the specific illness is, you've moved on to the next place and you can define it better. Rather than having an argument as to whether you do or don't have an illness.
Yes, yeah. So I think it was an interesting thing. And so in Manchester, when you were having those discussions about using the term cult or not cult, she was sitting a few rows. I could hear her say, "No, it's a good term," and people were arguing that it wasn't a good term. That boy, has the world changed in many ways. But part of that is not necessarily always. Part of my work is a lot more, I think, is about diplomacy. And so when we do intervention work, it's a lot more based upon the works of diplomacy. Not coming in saying your group is bad, here's what's wrong with it. Because for me, a relationship with someone is more important than what they believe. So if the option is I have a relationship with my child who's in Scientology, or I don't have a relationship with my child who's in Scientology, I think that I prefer that the person have a relationship with the person in Scientology.
Always.
With the thought that, accurate or inaccurate, most people are going to leave. And if they have no relationship with you, there's no place for them to come out.
Maintain rapport, yeah.
So maintaining rapport. And so I think that in our field, there's a lack of diplomacy with people who hold different ideas than I do. So I may hold very different ideas on some subjects with someone like Dr. Barker or Richardson or Bromley or Shoup or any of these people, Melton. But I also can be very friendly with them and sit down and have a dinner and have a dialogue. In fact, Richardson was an expert who testified against me in my lawsuit against Maharishi. Yet I met him in Aix-en-Provence at a conference on the sociology of religion, and we had dinner and drinks, and we had a great conversation. And he was like giving me papers. He said, "Would you recorrect this?" I said things that are not correct. I mean, he was willing because there was a humanness and a genuineness. Same thing happened with Joe Zimhart. Had an interaction with Richardson, and Richardson wanted to write a paper with him because I think that diplomacy is something that in our field we're lacking. I understand why it is lacking, because some of these assholes that hurt you, these groups that hurt you and have done horrible things, no one wants to be, let's have the diplomatic relationship with the pedophile who just sexually abused my child. I get that part of it.
Yeah.
But in the big picture, we have to understand why the pedophile does what the pedophile does, so that we can separate those people so they don't get near our children. So if someone doesn't dialogue with the pedophile, continuing that analogy, then we're not going to learn anything.
It's also true that in the academic field, it is a very vicious field. Diplomacy in academia is, certainly in the social sciences, is incredibly lacking. And trying to have, I've always, from the moment even while I was in Scientology, I read books that were hostile to Scientology and considered what they were saying. I was willing to talk with anyone. I mean, one of the early gains of Scientology, the communication release, the grade 0 release, you're meant to be able to talk freely with anyone on any subject. And I,
at any time,
before I did that, I could, and I'm always willing to do that. As you say, where real offense has been caused. So if I'm talking to somebody about the Holocaust, and this has happened, where somebody will say it didn't happen, there was no Holocaust, and I'll say, well, my father was at the liberation of Belsen, and he certainly believes that there was a Holocaust. And you can watch the film, A Painful Reminder, that was made of the liberation of Belsen. And if they catch me at the wrong moment, if I'm not in a diplomatic frame,
Yeah.
I might well be rude to them,
Yep.
But
I agree.
it depends on the severity of the offense. And, so as you say, cult apologists, whatever we're going to call them, they're very variable. That I think that Eileen Barker has made mistakes along the way in her affiliation. I am concerned about the way that Chesner is run, and that the bias therein, and the vitriol. I'm a close friend of Professor Alexander Dworkin, and I'm horrified seeing the attacks that Chesner pursues against him. I don't understand it at all. Having known this man for more than 25 years and knowing him to be a kind and considerate and scholarly man who does what he does out of a concern for other human beings, certainly not out of any concern to harm anybody. Right. And they keep repeating this notion that he somehow wants the Russian Orthodox Church to, command and control everything. Well, I've spoken at a conference that he arranged in St. Petersburg where there were members of other churches. They were atheists. He even invited an agnostic like me to speak. That's no part of what's happening. What obviously is where they become hired guns. So Gordon Melton wrote an appallingly poor book about Scientology, in which he dismisses the work of Russell Miller, who wrote a fine biography of Hubbard, which I worked on. He dismisses me in a line as well, because he says we've not seen Scientology's archives of material. Now, he's wrong. I had people for years going in and out of the archive. We got some very damaging material that came from there. He's also wrong in that the most serious material in the archive, Gerald Armstrong made copies of when it was with Omar Garrison, at the time Hubbard's official biographer, before they paid him not to publish the biography. So core material was there. They themselves had put Hubbard's teenage diaries, 3 diaries, into court. And there was a lift on the court seal on the documents, and Michael Flynn, the lawyer, made sure I got all of them. So we had a lot of archive material and core archive material. And the idea that if you don't have the Kim family library, you can't say anything about what they did. Great. Preposterous. Right, it's also everything in his book is actually in PR statements made by Scientology and very easy to disprove. L. Ron Hubbard was never a blood brother of the Blackfoot Indians, because as the Blackfoot Indians have pointed out, the Bikuni, their historian and one of their tribal leaders, we've never made any blood brothers. He was made a blood brother in the 1980s.
I get, look, there's a whole shade of people who say all kinds of things.
But a particular problem I have is this is not scholarship, because he was paid to write this book. And this kind of mercenary work, we really should be very careful of it. Where, I think where Eileen has been willing to move her opinion. And as I say, in 1991, when I contacted her, and there was a lot of noise about Inform, and we'd seen this leaked document that says that they were looking for money from the Moonies, that they were proud that they were obliterating the anti-cult movement. This was scary stuff. But I contacted her after reading her book, New Religious Movements, which I thought was generally a good book, and said, I think this is a good book. And I then made a series of corrections about the chapter on Scientology, and Inform, the group that she'd founded at the London School of Economics, started sending they'd been sending people to St. Hill. When parents or friends complained, they'd send them down to talk to Scientology. And, that bothered me a little.
Yeah.
For the next 3 or 4 years, all of the referrals came to me. So I don't have quite the same perspective on this. I'm sort of in the middle on this one. I'm not on a side.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I just think these people we often want to characterize all people as a group of people. And I
Yeah,
think
call them a cult or call them a cult
yeah,
apologist or what have you, and we're in trouble.
and there's a whole variety of views, and it's one that I don't think it's helpful. So
No.
I go back to this word diplomacy. Um, I think that our intervention work is a lot more about diplomacy
Mm.
and respect of the people we're working with. And I think that even the people that you disagree with vehemently and hold a very, very different viewpoint, you can have a dignified, respectful conversation with them.
I always, year in, year out, recommend John Stuart Mill on Liberty. This book where this brilliant man says, you know the person you're talking to is an idiot. You've heard everything they have to say. Listen again, because you could be wrong. You know, I never have been, of course, but
well, at USC, University of Southern California, they have a department of diplomacy, and they have a great website with all kinds of materials.
oh, look at that.
I have on one of our websites links to some specific articles that I think are helpful for families, because it's how to get along with people that you disagree with is an interesting thing. And I some of this is cultural for me and family of origin. My dad, when I went off into Hindu land, was not pleased. Having, as I think I said earlier, my grandparents meet at the University of Minnesota in 1900. They homestead a farm in South Dakota. All these kids, 100 miles square, German community, 3 Irish families. Everybody else spoke German. Lots of prejudice. Grandfather dies at 34. All these things impacted who my father was as a person. And one of the things he loved was horses. He loved riding horses. He didn't very frequently get, but every time we'd go back to the family farms, he'd be on that horse, and he'd be gone. He loved horses.
Yeah.
And he was almost a horse whisperer. My sister bought a farm one time, and there were 2 sort of old horses out at pasture, and no one could catch them. And so they asked my dad, will you go get them? And he went out into this field, this pasture, and he came back one by one, riding them bareback just by their bridle. He had an intimate kind of relationship with the animal. I say that because when I would try to convince my father to meditate, and give him all the reasons why he should meditate, he would always end up with, son, what you enjoy and love about life is meditating. And what I love is horses, riding horses. And if I had 5 extra minutes in a day, I'd ride a horse. And so he always found ways of not making me wrong, but in his way, not giving in by teaching me what he had an appreciation for. Doesn't mean that I have to have some appreciation for the same thing. And there was a lesson in there. And I try in some ways to bring that to our work. And a little bit of that is diplomacy, of understanding that people see the world in a different way and trying to find the common ground. There's a Benedictine monk, English Benedictine monk that we work with, he's sort of the envoy to new religious movements for the Vatican, and specifically the Krishnas. And he's a very interesting man. Joe Kelly went to college with him. I've known him for 45 years. He's a clinical psychologist. He actually helps us on cases. He's brought people that have joined want to become monks. And he thinks that they're joining from a cult of reason, and brought them to my house for me to convince them that they shouldn't be a monk. I laugh. But he tells a story in diplomacy that and about appreciating what someone loves about a group. And he said that when Muhammad had his visions and wanted to get rid of all kind of iconography within the churches and the crosses, any symbolic form of God other than these geometric forms, his brother went around like getting rid of the icons, cutting off the crosses. But he went into one church and there was, let me back up just a second. He asked me a question. He said, when I do interfaith dialogue with Islam, where do you think we start? How do we do that? We think Jesus is God, they don't. So these are two different worldviews. Where do we start? And I said, I have no idea. And he said, we start with the Virgin Mary. I'm like, oh, what is that? And now we'll go back to where I left off. When Muhammad's brother was going through getting rid of all the iconography, there was one icon. And it was Mary holding the baby Jesus.
Mm.
And he said that one can stay. And so he said, that's where we start.
Mm.
We start where we can agree.
Yeah.
And then based upon what we can agree, we can have relationships, meaningful relationships, friendships, recognizing that we have vast differences, but we can find areas of common ground. And I think that the work that I have more moved to over the last 30 years is on finding that common ground. And by doing that, reducing the tension that exists between families and groups. I have this kind of idea that when you fight against people, they have to justify. But if you cannot fight against what they're doing and try to have real dialogue, they no longer have to justify.
I've
what
never
they're doing.
used, I did intervention work up until 1995. And so I first started talking to people at the end of 1983. But to me, there was never an argument. There was never a proving that somebody that something was wrong. It was, you start, I mean, Eric Fromm talks about love, and he's talking about, a mature love rather than, Yuval and I did we had a talk about this, which we put up on the site, in which he took apart the other parts of love. And I'm sort of saying, no, he's talking about mature love. He's talking about when you've grown up as a human being, then you'll have respect, responsibility, care, and knowledge, these four aspects. And the diplomacy starts with respect.
Yeah.
And if you don't start from there, what you have is warfare.
You got. I agree.
Yeah.
There's other parts I'm going to look up because I'm going to steal them and add them to our materials.
Where you can simply go to the talk that Yuval and I did and steal them from there.
Okay, but I may not quote you, and I may absorb it as my own.
Well, yeah, I'm charged for it, definitely.
Yeah.
But read The Art of Loving by Eric Fromm. It's a fantastic book.
Okay. I mean, I think that you added some texture and layers to it. So in this this war, I often believe that. I think that most people in groups, and again, these are generalizations because we don't have good research, but most people in groups are happy and unhappy, content, not content. It's changing all the time. Certainly that was my experience, and I don't know if I can extrapolate from my experience to everybody else. But anecdotally, I that's at least the lens that I see group involvement. And I believe that if you have an enemy, you don't have to feel that conflict. And if you can remove the enemy, people are left with themselves and manipulating.
Yeah.
And they can feel it. So I really try to get families off this confrontation and more toward diplomacy, finding areas of agreement so that the person is left with themselves and they can make decisions more effectively. So those are the things that I had written down. I agree about this word cult. It's interesting that someone like Barker found it to be useful for some people at a certain stage. We were talking about diplomacy, and I think we're in pretty much agreement. I don't think that the field I don't want to use the word anti-cult field, but I don't know another word thing, always holds these same views.
No.
And
very much not. And also it's a field where there's some driven people who and narcissistic people, dare I say, who have their own agenda and their own they need to be healed from their own experience, and they're not willing to be healed from their own experience because they have taken on the authoritarian stance that they know everything and there's nothing to be done. But that's probably a discussion for another day, because that would probably take another hour.
Well, I mean, just on that, Dr. Langoni, Michael Langoni, he frequently says, "I am not a cult fighter. That's not what I am.
No.
What my work is about is research and trying to bring people together. I certainly was a cult fighter for the first 10 years of my involvement in this. Certainly because I was
you went out with a placard,
Yeah. I was at war. The usefulness of that war is gone. It's no longer there. And I'm not a cult fighter. And so there are a lot of cult fighters. And
I've been called an anti-Scientologist, and whenever that expression comes up, I'm like, no, I'm a pro-Scientologist. I was never at war with Scientology, the organization, save to defend myself from its depredations and harassment, which was a daily thing for 16 years. My whole concern, I was asked to talk at an event called Flag Down, and so they called me up, and I think I was the first person invited to talk, and they were going to go to Clearwater, Florida and have this event. And I said, absolutely not. What are you doing this for? And the friend who'd called me up said, oh, well, it'll get media. And I'm so, well, why do you want media? Well, because then they won't be able to recruit people. And I'm sort of, look, people have seen South Park now. They can't recruit. Let's forget that. All it's going to do is make it harder for the Sea organization members who are being abused on a daily basis. It's going to make it harder for them to leave. And so I am not for this at all. It's oppositional, it's confrontational. And I don't, the anonymous picketing of Scientology, I don't think it did any good. The thing is that I would like to help the people. I years ago, and Margaret Singer actually picked this woman up and helped her beyond. But I had a woman who'd been involved for 20 years, and she told me that she'd walked out. She'd decided she couldn't take it anymore. And she was leaving this man she'd married, who was the love of her life, because she knew that he couldn't leave. So she was in a really terrible place. But just describing her daily life, she said that she usually slept 2 hours a night on a bit of foam under her bed. Now, my thought is, how can I help such people? I years ago interviewed a lovely guy called Carlos Cornier, who was involved in this organization, and he was on the rehabilitation project force, the slave labor force, where the conditions are dreadful.
Horrible.
And some picketers came around, and one of them spat at him. And to me, that put everything in a nutshell, that you just don't have the right target. It's your own rage and your own loathing that's coming out. And these people deserve to be helped. So I've never been an anti-cultist or an anti-Scientologist or anything like that.
Well, I certainly was.
Yeah, well, and that's, but you've cured that now.
Well, I just
and it was necessary in your process.
It was for me. It had its usefulness, as that term cult had its usefulness.
Yeah.
But like the women that were branded in NXIVM and have gone through this horrendous thing, I would be an anti-cultist. I'm not.
I'm a let's put Keith Raniere in prisonist.
Yeah. Well, that would be a good way to think about it. But in terms of helping people, and I think that's what you described, spitting in someone's face who's on the Sea Org, doing those things is not going to help that person leave. It's going to make them think that the group is right and you are wrong. And you're working out your own shit in a way that probably is not healthy. And so that movement toward diplomacy, respect, I think has evolved over time. I know that in my work, I've become much more successful in terms of helping people leave. When I've moved out of the last 28 years, that kind of thinking.
Yeah.
There's a lot to chat about.
Well, let's pick this up again on another day. This has been
good.
Fantastic. It's been great talking with you.
All right.
I'm John Atack, and this is my good friend, Pat Ryan. Thank you
All
for
right.
watching.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.
Well, there are no chickens involved in
Yeah,
Scientology.
well, that's OT 46.